The Counter-Reformation was the period of Catholic resurgence beginning with the Council of Trent and ending at the close of the 30 Years' War, and was initiated in response to the Protestant Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was a comprehensive effort composed of four major elements: ecclesiastical or structural reconfiguration, religious orders, spiritual movements, political dimensions. Such reforms included the foundation of seminaries for the proper training of priests in the spiritual life and the theological traditions of the Church, the reform of religious life by returning orders to their spiritual foundations, and new spiritual movements focusing on the devotional life and a personal relationship with Christ, including the Spanish mystics and the French school of spirituality. It also involved political activities that included the Roman Inquisition. One primary emphasis of the Counter-Reformation was a mission to reach parts of the world that had been colonized as predominantly Catholic and also try to reconvert areas such as Sweden and England that were at one time Roman Catholic. Precursors. The 14th, 15th and 16th centuries saw a spiritual revival in Europe, in which the question of salvation became central. This became known as the Catholic Reformation. Several theologians harked back to the early days of Christianity and questioned their spirituality. Their debates expanded across the whole of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, while secular critics also examined religious practice, clerical behavior and the Church's positions. Several varied currents of thought were active, but the ideas of reform and renewal were led by the clergy. The reforms decreed at Lateran v. had only a small effect. Even so, conservative and reforming parties still survived within the Catholic Church even as the Protestant Reformation spread. The Protestant Church decisively broke from the Catholic Church in the 1520s. The two distinct dogmatic positions within the Catholic Church solidified in the 1560s. The Catholic Reformation became known as the Counter-Reformation, defined as a reaction to Protestantism rather than as a reform movement. The regular orders made their first attempts at reform in the 14th century. The Benedictine Bull of 1336 reformed the Benedictines and Cistercians. In 1523, the Camaldolese hermits of Monte Corona were recognized as a separate congregation of monks. In 1435, Saint Francis of Paola founded the Poor Hermits of Saint Francis of Assisi, who became the Minim Friars. In 1526, Matteo de Bascio suggested reforming the Franciscan rule of life to its original purity, giving birth to the Capuchins, recognized by the Pope in 1619. This order was well known to the laity and play an important role in public preaching. To respond to the new needs of evangelism, clergy formed into religious congregations, taking special vows but with no obligation to assist in a monastery's religious offices. These regular clergy taught, preached and took confession, but were under a bishop's direct authority and not linked to a specific parish or area like a vicar or canon. In Italy, the first congregation of regular clergy was the Theatines, founded in 1524 by Gaetano and Cardinal Caraffa. This was followed by the Somaci Fathers in 1528, the Barnabites in 1530, the Ursulines in 1535, the Jesuits, canonically recognized in 1540, the Clerics Regular of the Mother of God of Lucca in 1583, the Camelians in 1584, the Adorno Fathers in 1588, and finally the Piarists in 1621. In 1524, a number of priests in Rome began to live in a community centered on Philip Neri. The Oratorians were given their institutions in 1564 and recognized as an order by the Pope in 1575. They used music and singing to attract the faithful. Council of Trent. Pope Paul III is considered to be the first pope of the Counter-Reformation, and also initiated the Council of Trent, a commission of cardinals tasked with institutional reform, addressing contentious issues such as corrupt bishops and priests, indulgences, and other financial abuses. The council upheld the basic structure of the medieval church, its sacramental system, religious orders, and doctrine. It rejected all compromise with the Protestants, restating basic tenets of the Roman Catholic faith. The council upheld salvation appropriated by grace through faith and works of that faith, because faith without works is dead. As the Epistle of St. James states, transubstantiation, according to which the consecrated bread and wine are held to have been transformed really and substantially into the body, blood, soul and divinity of Christ, was also reaffirmed, as were the traditional 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. Other practices that drew the ire of Protestant reformers, such as pilgrimages, the veneration of saints and relics, the use of venerable images and statuary, and the veneration of the Virgin Mary, were strongly reaffirmed as spiritually commendable practices. The Council, in the Canon of Trent, officially accepted the Vulgate listing of the Old Testament Bible, which included the deuterocanonical works on a par with the 39 books customarily found in the Masoretic text. This reaffirmed the previous Council of Rome and synods of Carthage, which had affirmed the Deuterocanon as scripture. The Council also commissioned the Roman Catechism, which still serves as authoritative church teaching. While the traditional fundamentals of the Church were reaffirmed, there were noticeable changes to answer complaints that the counter-reformers were tacitly willing to admit were legitimate. Among the conditions to be corrected by Catholic reformers was the growing divide between the clerics and the laity. Many members of the clergy in the rural parishes, after all, had been poorly educated. Often, these rural priests did not know Latin and lacked opportunities for proper theological training. Parish priests were to be better educated in matters of theology and apologetics, while papal authorities sought to educate the faithful about the meaning, nature and value of art and liturgy, particularly in monastic churches. Notebooks and handbooks became more common, describing how to be good priests and confessors. Thus, the Council of Trent attempted to improve the discipline and administration of the Church. The worldly excesses of the secular Renaissance Church, epitomized by the era of Alexander VI, intensified during the Reformation under Pope Leo X, whose campaign to raise funds for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica by supporting use of indulgences served as a key impetus for Martin Luther's 95 Theses. The Catholic Church responded to these problems by a vigorous campaign of reform, inspired by earlier Catholic reform movements that predated the Council of Constance. Humanism, devotionalism, legalism and the Observantine tradition. The Council, by virtue of its actions, repudiated the pluralism of the secular Renaissance which had previously plagued the Church. The organization of religious institutions was tightened, discipline was improved, and the parish was emphasized. The appointment of bishops for political reasons was no longer tolerated. In the past, the large land holdings forced many bishops to be absent bishops, who at times were property managers trained in administration. Thus, the Council of Trent combated absenteeism, which was the practice of bishops living in Rome or on landed estates rather than in their dioceses. The Council of Trent also gave bishops greater power to supervise all aspects of religious life. Zealous prelates, such as Milan's Archbishop Carlo Borromeo, later canonized as a saint, set an example by visiting the remotest parishes and instilling high standards. Religious orders. New religious orders were a fundamental part of the reforms. Orders such as the Capuchins, Discalced Carmelites, Discalced Augustinians, Augustinian Recollects, Cistercian Fulants, Ursulines, Theatines, Barnabites, and especially Jesuits worked in rural parishes and set examples of Catholic renewal. The Theatines undertook checking the spread of heresy and contributed to a regeneration of the clergy. The Capuchins, an offshoot of the Franciscan order notable for their preaching and for their care for the poor and the sick, grew rapidly. Capuchin-founded confraternities took special interest in the poor and lived austerely. Members of orders active in overseas missionary expansion expressed the view that the rural parishes often needed Christianizing as much as the heathens of Asia and the Americas. The Ursulines focused on the special task of educating girls, the first order of women to be dedicated to that goal. Devotion to the traditional works of mercy exemplified the Catholic Reformation's reaffirmation of the importance of both faith and works and salvation through God's grace, and repudiation of the maxim sola scriptura emphasized by Protestant sects. Not only did they make the Church more effective, but they also reaffirmed fundamental premises of the medieval Church. The Jesuits were the most effective of the new Catholic orders. An heir to the devotional, observantine, and legalist traditions, the Jesuits organized along military lines. The worldliness of the Renaissance Church had no part in their new order. Loyola's masterwork Spiritual Exercises showed the emphasis of handbooks characteristic of Catholic reformers before the Reformation. Reminiscent of devotionalism, the Jesuits became preachers, confessors to monarchs and princes, and humanist educators, forced to self-justify their position by unflattering prophetic figures and epithets utilized by Protestant Bible scholars of the papacy. The Jesuits utilized two counter-interpretations of these self-same prophecies, futurism and preterism. These were devised to deflect the strength of Protestant Reformation teachings and to shift the use of the Antichrist and analogous prophecies away from the Pope and out of the Middle Ages. These methods left an enduring mark upon history. Their efforts are largely credited with stemming Protestantism in Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, southern Germany, France, and the Spanish Netherlands. Jesuits participated in the expansion of the Church in the Americas and Asia by their missionary activity. Loyola's biography contributed to an emphasis on popular piety that had waned under political popes such as Alexander VI and Leo X. After recovering from a serious wound, he took a vow to serve only God and the Roman pontiff, his vicar on earth. The emphasis on the Pope is a reaffirmation of the medieval papalism, while the Council of Trent defeated conciliarism. The belief that general councils of the Church collectively were God's representative on earth rather than the Pope. Taking the Pope as an absolute ruler, the Jesuits contributed to the Counter-Reformation Church along a line harmonized to the Vatican. Politics. The Netherlands. When the Calvinists took control of various parts of the Netherlands in the Dutch Revolt, the Catholics led by Philip II of Spain fought back. The king sent in Alexander Farnese as Governor-General of the Spanish Netherlands from 1578 to 1592. Farnese led a successful campaign 1578 to 1592 against the Dutch Revolt, in which he captured the main cities in the South Spanish Belgium and returned them to the control of Catholic Spain. He took advantage of the divisions in the ranks of his opponents between the Dutch-speaking Flemish and the French-speaking Walloons, using persuasion to take advantage of the divisions and foment the growing discord. By doing so he was able to bring back the Walloon provinces to an allegiance to the king. By the Treaty of Arras in 1579, he secured the support of the malcontents, as the Catholic nobles of the south were styled. The 7 northern provinces as well as Flanders and Brabant, controlled by Calvinists, responded with the Union of Utrecht, where they resolved to stick together to fight Spain. Farnese secured his base in Hainaut and Artois, then moved against Brabant and Flanders. City after city fell. Tournai, Maastricht, Breda, Bruges and Ghent opened their gates. Farnese finally laid siege to the great seaport of Antwerp. The town was open to the sea, strongly fortified, and well defended under the leadership of Marnix van Street. Aldegond. Farnese cut off all access to the sea by constructing a bridge of boats across the Scheldt. The city surrendered in 1585 as 60,000 Antwerp citizens fled north. All of the southern Netherlands was once more under Spanish control. In a war composed mostly of sieges rather than battles, he proved his mettle. His strategy was to offer generous terms for surrender. There would be no massacres or looting, historic urban privileges were retained, there was a full pardon and amnesty. Return to the Catholic Church would be gradual. Meanwhile, Catholic refugees from the north regrouped in Cologne and Douai, and developed a more militant, Tridentine identity. Spiritual movements. The Catholic Reformation was not only a political and church policy-oriented movement, but it also included major figures such as Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Francis de Sales, and Philip Neri, who added to the spirituality of the Catholic Church. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross were Spanish mystics and reformers of the Carmelite order, whose ministry focused on interior conversion to Christ, the deepening of prayer, and commitment to God's will. Teresa was given the task of developing and writing about the way to perfection in her love and unity with Christ. Her publications, especially her autobiography The Life of Teresa of Jesus, had multiple effects. It's to be placed besides the Confessions of Augustine. Thomas Merton called John of the Cross the greatest of all mystical theologians. An important clarification about the word mystical is necessary here. When one considers its definition or the nature of mysticism, a common misunderstanding exists that if one is to become a mystic they are required to seclude themselves physically from the outside world to have this kind of experience. Although such seclusion can, indeed, be the only apostolate to which some are called to a life of prayer, there are others who have dual apostolates. In fact, John of the Cross himself served as both confessor, spiritual director within the confines of the cloistered communities that he and Teresa of Avila worked vigorously to establish. But he also literally helped to build a number of those convents and monasteries. It is true that Ignatius of Loyola and Francis de Sales were called to a more active spirituality or apostolate, but their vocations were not the opposite of Teresa of Jesus and John of the Cross, as this article previously indicated. Returning to Ignatius of Loyola, to see God in all things was a typical expression of Ignatius and a main theme of his spiritual exercises. The spirituality of Filippo Neri, who lived in Rome at the same time as Ignatius, was practically oriented too, but totally opposed to the Jesuit approach. Said Filippo, "If I have a real problem, I contemplate what Ignatius would do, and then I do the exact opposite." As a recognition of their joint contribution to the spiritual renewal within the Catholic Reformation, Ignatius of Loyola, Filippo Neri, and Teresa of Avila were canonized on the same day, March 12, 1622. The Virgin Mary played an increasingly central role in Catholic devotions. The victory at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was accredited to the Virgin Mary and signified the beginning of a strong resurgence of Marian devotions. During and after the Catholic Reformation, Marian piety experienced unforeseen growth, with over 500 pages of Mariological writings during the 17th century alone. The Jesuit Francisco Suarez was the first theologian to use the Thomas method on Marian theology. Other well-known contributors to Marian spirituality are Lawrence of Brindisi, Robert Bellarmine, and Francis of Sales. The sacrament of penance was transformed from a social to a personal experience, that is, from a public community act to a private confession. It now took place in private in a confessional.